Hey guys, um, it's almost the end. So at 6 we're going to go for drinks and have beer and soju. But I need you to hang on for another 40 to 45 minutes. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Are you all still awake? Come on guys. Are we all still awake? Awesome. Are we having a good time? Thank you. So, they've asked me to talk about the venture ecosystem in Singapore and what is happening, because Singapore has been an example for a lot of ecosystem in terms of how do I grow an ecosystem as a country. So what I'll do is I'll try and take you to actually kind of our personal journey as a VC fund. So I talked a little bit about myself. I'll talk a little bit about the fund that I work for, Golden Gate Ventures. I know there's been different country sessions earlier today and yesterday, but I'll briefly talk about Southeast Asia as well, and then we'll do a deeper dive into what is happening in Singapore. So the one thing that is important, and to make sure that you guys stay awake until the end, please ask questions. I know that the organization asked me to do questions at the end, but I would like to have this a very, very interactive session. So if you have a question, don't hesitate, raise your hand, and I'll walk up to you, and then hopefully I'll be able to answer your question. So don't be shy. Awesome. So let's briefly talk about me, so that you know who I am and what am I doing here. So this is me on a bike. So cycling is an important part of my life. I do triathlons and Ironmans. Prior working for Golden Gate Ventures, I'm a former entrepreneur. So my former business is a data center. So basically what we did, this is early 2000s, was we decided, there wasn't any Amazon Cloud or Microsoft Azure. We decided that we would outsource IT for small and medium enterprises, and decided to do it by building a data center. This company got acquired, this is back in the Netherlands, 6 years later. And in the process of thinking what I wanted to do with my life, I worked for the Dutch Prime Minister for a few years as a political and economical advisor. And that led me to kind of thinking about my career in a sort of international perspective. Very randomly, during a course at Harvard in Boston, one of my classmates who lived in Singapore introduced me to the two co-founders of Golden Gate Ventures, two of the three co-founders. We had an amazing conversation about the ecosystem, and remind you, this is back in 2012, 2013. The ecosystem wasn't as close where it is right now, so it was very, very early days. So we had a great conversation, we had a dinner, and they were talking about how enthusiastic and how psyched they were about what was happening in Singapore and the surrounding countries. No, that kind of rubbed off on me, and I decided to move the family and go to Singapore. As you can see, I'm also a proud dad of two wonderful kids, Lana and Amare, 7 and 3. So Lana actually, she moved to Singapore when she was a year and a half, so very young, and she's now learning Mandarin, so that's pretty cool. Okay, enough about me. By the way, if you have any questions about cycling, you can ask that as well. So a little bit about the firm. So Golden Gate Ventures started in 2011, and we did our first investments in 2012. Again, as I told earlier, 2011, 2012 was very, very early days. You didn't have a massive amount of venture capital firms in Singapore yet. You didn't have a massive amount of founders founding companies. People were still working at big corporates. There were only a few accelerators. And, to be honest, being a startup wasn't as hip or as trendy or as cool as it is right now. Companies like, and you might know the names, like Grab and Gojek were literally just starting. So the start of the fund, although it was very early, was also very interesting. because we had the opportunity to know the region, to go to Vietnam, to go to Indonesia, to go to Thailand, to go to the Philippines, and get to know these founders, and get to know and understand what drives them to build a company. And we also learned that all of those companies were actually building infrastructure. Because in a region where there is, who's been, by raise of hands, who's been to Jakarta, by the way? A few people. So if you go to Jakarta in the heavy rain, you'll know that your mobile, it will work, but your connection will be very slow. So when it comes to infrastructure, and if you're building a company, it's very difficult to hit your target audience if Wi-Fi or if 3G is very, very slow. So the thing you need to do is you need to sort of adapt to those circumstances. So one of the first companies we've invested in, there's a number of them, but one of the first companies is a company called Carousel. So this is a C2C marketplace. Think of eBay, Craigslist. And when Surey and his team were sort of building the company, Vinny, one of the co-founders, was kind of looking at the company and looking at their data. They were still in university. They were still in university and sort of building a company. So we had to step back and think of, okay, this is a company pretty similar to what eBay and Craigslist are doing. Why are they making a difference? So why is this company different than eBay? Or why would this company be better than Craigslist? So the most important thing for us when making that decision is digital device. So if you think of the start of an ecosystem, I'm born and raised in the Netherlands. When I was 11, and okay, I'm a bit older now, I'm 44, so I used to have an MSX computer, and we know what an MSX computer is? Atari? Yeah, Atari, there you go, thank you. Thank you. So Atari rings a bell. So I had a desktop computer, like a big computer. A lot of kids in Southeast Asia, their computer is a mobile device. So they will do everything on their mobile, whether it's payments, watching movies, everything. So mobile is their life. And Carousel was smart enough to say, we might be a C2C marketplace, but we only want to focus on mobile. Because mobile gives us a lot of great opportunities. If I want to sell my shoes, I'm a big shoe fan. If I want to sell my sneakers, it is just taking a picture, putting it on the platform, and getting it sold. Whilst on eBay, I'll take a picture, I have to upload the picture to my computer, log into my account, then make a description, etc. It will take much longer. So they've redefined what a C2C marketplace is, actually using their mobile device. And you know what's funny? There are companies in mature markets that copied their model. So that makes it interesting. So again, we saw Carousel in 2013. So again, it's very early days. And now they are in 7 or 8 countries. They are the #1 marketplace in several of these countries. So our fund has invested in more than 30 companies across the region. We actually have a few investments here in Korea as well. Our thesis is that we want to focus on what we call consumer internet, and everything that revolves around consumer internet. So think of payments, think of logistics, think of discovery, so content and media. We started out with a few people back in 2012. We're now with 18 team members across Singapore and Indonesia. Let's skip to the next slide. Okay, so a few interesting data points before we're going to talk about Singapore. So I told you I want to talk high level about what is happening in Southeast Asia. So the biggest thing in the region at this moment, and if you kind of look at any newspaper or look at any blog, or look at TechCrunch or any of those similar blogs, you'll typically hear about companies that are in Indonesia or are in Singapore. So you'll see that Singapore and Indonesia are actually sort of the major, I would say the big giants in Southeast Asia. Singapore for the fact of being ease of doing business, and Indonesia, of course, for being a large market. But what is interesting about this chart is if you look at the amount of money invested per country, Indonesia, which is the purple one, clearly takes the cake. The funny thing is, if you look at the number of deals done per country, both Singapore and Indonesia are almost equal. So, what is happening here? What you'll see is that if any company in Southeast Asia is looking to raise money, is looking to expand their business, Indonesia can be their home market and it could actually be their only market. For years and years, a company called Gojek, which is a ride-hailing company, only focused on Indonesia before expanding to other countries. So the number of investors, and I'm talking about large companies, late-stage investors with the likes of Tencent and Alibaba, have focused their attention on Indonesia. But then if you look at the number of deals done, Singapore is important because a lot of companies will have their holding in Singapore. Because Singapore is transparent, it's a mature market, and a lot of the venture capitalists like ourselves are based out of Singapore. What else is interesting is if you look at another big market, like the Philippines, 100 million people, they only account for a very small portion of capital and number of deals. So what you'll see across the region is, although we talk about Southeast Asia as a region, the countries move in different tempos. And it has to do with regulation, it has to do with politics, it has to do with big families investing, it has to do with the number of VCs on the ground, it has to do with education system, and number of people that are willing to start a company. So it's very important when you look at this region, if you look at it actually from a almost country by country perspective. So what you can do is, once you are a number one or a number two player in your country, you can then think about expanding into other countries. Similar to what actually Gojek has done, for example. Okay, another trend that we see in Southeast Asia. And as I said, bear with me, I'm going to talk about Southeast Asia a little bit before diving deeper into Singapore. Any ecosystem that starts typically with a government being very, very active in helping entrepreneurs. Something we've seen in markets like Israel, but also what we've seen, of course, in Singapore. But the thing is, if you ignite or help start an ecosystem, you'll get a lot of companies that are trying to raise capital through grants or through angel investments or through seed investments. But if those companies survive, they need more capital. So if there's a seed company and they will raise a Series A round, there needs to be Series A investors. The difficulty is if you start as an investor, you'll start doing seed investments, you don't have a Series A fund ready to do follow-on investments in your portfolio companies. So an ecosystem grows. The more companies that get to Series A, the more Series A funds will start in the region. The more companies that will get to Series B or Series C, the more investors will focus on those companies. So what this chart will basically tell you is that there's a huge number of seed investors. Angels, governments, family offices, seed funds, you name it. In recent years, there's almost an explosion of the Series A funds that came to the region. And I still remember that in 2014 we had a discussion at another conference where we said there's not enough Series A capital. And now the market is saying we're flooded by Series A capital. So it's an effect of how the market moves. But what you're seeing is when you get to Series B and Series C, there is less capital available. So this is how typical ecosystems grow and how ecosystems emerge. If I get invited back in the next 2 years, depends on how today goes, I'll bet you that the Series B investments will have increased because there's more funds available in the region, and likely the Series C ones as well. There's another interesting statistic, and just for you to know, is companies typically have a half-life. So if 100 companies have raised a seed round, about 50 of them will raise a Series A round. and it kind of continues to Series B and Series C as well. The reason why it has been less for Southeast Asia is there hasn't been as much later stage capital available for these companies. So you could be an amazing founder and have an amazing company and have amazing traction. It would still be hard for you to raise a later stage round because there's hardly any investors in that space to invest in your company. So this company typically would go to corporates and family offices and in some cases private equity funds. But again, as the ecosystem is maturing, we'll see more funds focusing on those Series B and Series C rounds as well. And again, this is just not me talking. We're actually using data from public sources to kind of follow these trends. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So basically, this says there's a lot of people in Southeast Asia, and a lot of them have a mobile phone. What is interesting though is that the population is very, very young. I think the average in Vietnam now is 28 years. The average in Singapore is 33. So if you look at markets like Japan, and I think even Korea, or look at Europe, it's mainly an elderly population. Southeast Asia is one of the youngest regions on the globe. So for you as entrepreneurs and investors, it is a huge opportunity. For someone that comes online for their first or second time and they're doing discovery and they're looking to buy stuff and they're looking to share their most intimate fantasies, it means there's a big market and there's a big opportunity for you to invest in, not only now, but also for the next 10 to 15 years. So think of that if you are building a company. This is a very, very big market to attack and approach. At least it's what gets us excited. Okay, so one of the other things that is promising is money. So what is happening in the ecosystem in general when it comes to money? If you go back 2 to 3 years, you'll see that most of the investment capital would have gone to maybe 3 or 4 companies. So a company called C. Used to be called Garena, a company called Grab, and a company called Gojek. So they would take a large portion of any capital that would be invested in the region. And this was a concern, because people were thinking, if there's only those few companies, that's not really an ecosystem. But if you look at it right now, I think Indonesia has, Indonesia now has 7 or 8, maybe even 9 unicorns. Singapore will soon have 4 or 5 unicorns. And the prediction is that 10 new companies with a market cap of over 1 billion will soon be in the region. So we're seeing companies that are now valued at 300, 400, 500, 600 million. They will hit that 1 billion stage pretty soon. Why is this important? So why is it important to have those unicorns in your market? I told you it's going to be interactive, so I need you guys to help out. I don't know the answer. So why is it important to have unicorns in your market? There you go. It's an example. So it attracts other startups. If you think of what Facebook and Google have done for the US ecosystem and eventually a global ecosystem, it basically means that it's an example for other companies. It attracts other startups. What it also does is it attracts acquisitions. These billion-dollar companies are able to buy other companies. Again, which builds an ecosystem. So we're slowly but steadily getting there. Temasek, which is a sovereign wealth fund in Singapore, and Google, they did a report, and they anticipate about $40 to $50 billion of investments in the ecosystem. So as it is maturing really, really fast. So what are the issues in the ecosystem? So a few things. I think one thing that scares everyone, but this is more on a global scale, is Brexit and US and China. Kind of no one knows what it will exactly mean for ecosystems here or in the US or in Europe or in Southeast Asia. but it is definitely a risk. I think what has become interesting is that tech used to be something for nerds, and then it used to be something for early adopters, but now it's becoming more common. So tech as an asset class for large investors like KKR or Warburg Pincus have become a serious asset class. Which now means that if you are an early stage investor or if you are a founder, that is an opportunity for those large firms to either invest in your company or work with you as well. And again, I mentioned it earlier, so the larger players, companies like Grab, companies like Gojek, but also Traveloka, a travel company in Indonesia, are now acquiring other companies. So they themselves have become those large, they were startups a few years ago, and they've become corporates that are, supplying jobs, but also acquiring other companies and making investments. So it gets exciting. It gets really exciting. So this is and I recognize that maybe some of the names are new to this audience. But what is interesting, so I mentioned that we had sort of 3-4 big companies a few years ago. Look at the ecosystem right now. So a lot of these companies have decided to go global. So if you look at iFlix, iFlix is a Netflix for Southeast Asia, for emerging markets. They've announced yesterday that they've raised over $50 million, and Fidelity, a large PE firm, led the round. What you'll also recognize that a lot of these companies are in the financial space, so in payments. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies are building infrastructure for the region, where a mature market as Korea has a very smooth and very transparent financial system. When you go to countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, they're literally building a financial infrastructure. So a lot of companies have taken an opportunity to build companies in that space. So if you only look at this list, companies like PayFast, Modalco, Akulaku, Gojek in a sense with their payments, Grab in a sense with their payments, they're all companies that have decided we want to build an infrastructure and focus on the payment space. What excites me personally is that we're seeing more and more that across every single, I would say almost every single category, so the $100 million plus, the $1 billion plus, and the $10 billion plus, we're seeing companies in that space. So again, I'll bet you that the companies in the $100 million plus range will be $1 billion plus companies in a few years. I'm going to pause for 1 second. Any questions? Okay, could you guys do me a small favor? If you have a laptop or a phone, just put it down for 1 second. Put it downstairs, put it down. Stand up. Everyone, up. I need you guys up. Stand up for a second. Everyone, yep, thank you. Okay. Person right to you. There's someone right to you. Shake the person right to you's hand. Say your name. The person right to you, shake hand. Say your name. Right or left, fine as well. Okay, stretch your arms. Okay, everyone is awake, great, you can sit down again. Thank you. I need to make sure that everyone stays awake through this, it's a long presentation, I need you to stay awake, thank you. As a follow-on, what we're seeing is that the $100 million plus companies are growing as well. Again, what you'll see is that Indonesia will definitely take the cake, and this simply has to do with a large demographic of 250 million people that could consume your product or service. Our estimate is that Vietnam is going to be a large market for these types of companies as well, but Vietnam is just coming online in terms of number of companies and interest for investments in that country as well. Okay, so this is kind of an overview of where Southeast Asia is, just kind of to recap what you guys might have heard earlier in the conference. And I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on what is happening in the Singapore ecosystem and what excites us and what are the lessons learned. So Singapore is interesting. Singapore has decided, and this is, I think back in 2010, 2011, that as a country, they want to be a hub for Southeast Asia, which also means that they want to attract foreign talent. And not only for the short term, they want to attract it for the long term. So, what are some of the things that you need to do? As a government, you need to be supportive to business. So if you want to open up a company in Singapore, it will take you 24 hours. It will literally take you 24 hours and you can do it online. So the ease of doing business is very, very important. Most of the banks in Singapore understand that if you are a young founder, you're not being helped by, a bank opening account will take 4 weeks. It will take 3 or 4 days. One of my friends was complaining, he opened up a new bank account at DBS in Singapore, and it took him 4 hours. And he said it was too long. I said in Europe, mature market, if you open up a bank account, it takes 2 weeks. So Singapore is extremely progressive when it comes to doing business. I talked earlier about sort of how young the population is. So if you look at the founder's age, and this might sound old, but the founder's age on average is 33. It's not old, I'm 44. I'm old, 33 is still young. But it has to do with one specific item. I don't know who knows why it looks slightly older. So people tend to have a job first. So the number of people doing a startup right out of college, that is very common in the US. It is a little bit common in Europe, in some countries, but it's not common in Singapore. So typically you work for maybe a bank or a law firm or a big corporate like Google or Facebook, and decide after, and maybe after having a long conversation with your parents, that you want to build a startup. So the average age is a little bit older than you might see in markets like the US or maybe even China. It's not all good. There are some things that we need to work on. Only 5% of the local founders are female. And you'll see that across everyone's portfolio. And it's getting better. If you look at Zelingo, which is founded by a woman named Ankiti, a very talented, very bright founder. If you look in our portfolio, Anna Gong, who runs Perks. So there are female founders, but the average number of female founders in other markets is higher than Singapore. So there's work that needs to be done. What is also interesting is that if you look at acquisitions, over 60% of the acquisitions are done by foreign companies. So why is that important? It means that regulation is very favorable for foreign companies. So if you think as a Unilever or Procter & Gamble or any large corporation looking to acquire companies, actually Singapore makes it relatively easy to do business in its country. And that is really important when it comes to investments and kind of building that ecosystem. So if you're an entrepreneur, Singapore can also be overwhelming. There is a lot in Singapore for entrepreneurs. So the government has been very proactive with grants and helping funds and helping with visas. So they've been very, very proactive in helping entrepreneurs. There's a huge number of incubators and co-working spaces. I think when we started the firm, there were maybe 1 or 2 at the time, maybe 1. I think if you now walk through Singapore and you walk through the CBD area, you'll literally trip over the incubators and accelerators. There's a large number of them around. All the major corporations have one, Unilever, Daimler, they all have incubators in Singapore. WeWork has opened 18 locations. So you have to imagine, Singapore is 25 by 45 kilometers. So it's a small little island. There's about 5.5 million people, and WeWork has 18 locations in Singapore alone. And what will surprise you, that all those locations are full. If you go to a WeWork location, it actually is hard to get a desk, because most of them are full. So that's interesting. So there's industries, so there's large conglomerates, banks, property, real estate companies that are now exploring investing into companies as well. But what is more interesting is education and venture capital funds. We have seen a huge increase of new funds coming online over the last few years, which is good because it gives entrepreneurs choice. It helps them not only work with one fund, but work with multiple funds over multiple rounds. And it is increasing as the ecosystem is maturing as well. Just briefly talk about government and regulation. So the government has actually now said, or they said a few years ago, that if you are a venture capital fund, we want you to be regulated. This is very important for founders. You want to make sure that the funds you work with are proper funds, that they have the proper LPs to work with, that they have the proper regulations and the proper checks and balances in order. So although Singapore is strict when it comes to being an investor, they're also very helpful. So we talk on a regular basis with the regulators on their consulting papers on how should we evolve this ecosystem and how can regulation help not only VCs but also founders. The government has launched sandboxes for blockchain companies to do POCs with larger banks. They've worked with banks on accelerator programs and incubation programs. So very, very progressive approach. Also Singapore said, we want to be the hub when it comes to technology. Basically finance and technology, but specifically technology. So Singapore has several labs. They do deep tech, biotech, AI, and literally work with the universities in Singapore to not only work around IP, but also start new companies. They now have a program with Temasek where basically if a professor has an idea, he's able to launch the idea and make it an actual company and get an investment straight off the bat. So very, very progressive when it comes to being that technology hub. We talked about funding. There is a large number of funds that decided to be in Singapore, and what it also means is that all the large corporations will have their offices in Singapore. Google increased their headcount in Singapore by 1,000 developers. Facebook is increasing their office space, LinkedIn. So all the big guys see Singapore as a hub, and that attracts more talent, and that talent also attracts more startups. I think the biggest issue kind of remains around how do you make sure that in a small country like Singapore, it stays exciting for those young people to kind of hang around and make friends and build a business and hopefully stay there for a longer time. So a few highlights that I see and that we've seen as why we should be in Singapore and why have they been able to kind of build an ecosystem. So I talked about ease of business earlier, but strong community is actually extremely important. Singapore is host of a large number of events. So for anyone that has been to Singapore around the Formula 1 race, which is the 3rd week of September, in that single week, there are 4 or 5 big conferences. Same goes for the period April-May. You tend to have really big conferences around the region or in Singapore. Again, it's important to build a community, to showcase what is happening in Singapore, to make connections. Even our fund, we do a large number of events in Singapore just to strengthen the community. I think the one thing I'm actually proud of in terms of being part of Golden Gate Ventures. So once a year, we do an event called Walkabout, and the gist of the event is very simple. So we ask all tech companies, big and small, so from Google, LinkedIn to kind of the smallest startup, to open their doors to the public. And what happens is the public can walk around, go to these companies, and learn what they're doing. So we had a company, Shopback, that opened their doors, and literally they had food for everyone, drinks, and you were able to kind of learn what the company was doing. We hosted office hours. The Singapore Stock Exchange hosted office hours. And that can only happen if there is a strong community willing to work together. Maybe it's a good idea for Korea, I don't know. Maybe you can think about it. I I think we own the rights to it though, so you have to talk to us. Another one that's very important in terms of doing business is IP protection. So when it comes to doing anything on the deep tech or AI side, protection of IP is extremely important. Singapore has globally one of the best environments for IP protection when it comes to IP lawyers, when it comes to support from the government, and a very, very strong legal environment. So what Singapore has basically done is, they said we're creating a complete environment around the entrepreneur, which helps them in their entire journey. One of the things they've also done is they've asked corporates, the really big firms, to set up corporate venture funds in Singapore. So the likes of Capital and Capital, which are large Singapore corporations, have been inspired to set up corporate venture arms as well and invest in startups. So really they want to close the loop when it comes to the ecosystem. This is one of the coolest slides ever. So if you look at kind of where does Singapore get its success, this is really important. So not all companies are originally founded in Singapore. And maybe one of the most prolific ones is Grab. Huge company. So Grab is a ride-hailing company. They're in most countries across Southeast Asia. They've raised several billions. Their valuation is over 10 billion already. The company is not founded in Singapore. But when they moved their headquarters to Singapore, the main reason was we want to attract and retain talent. And people like living in Singapore. It's a very good environment. So Singapore is able to attract large companies to build their headquarters there. Actually, a number of startups have decided to open up R&D centers specifically in Singapore because it makes it easier to retain talent. So when it comes to incorporation, your primary operations, getting funding, funding is still a very, very local business. So if you have headquarters in Singapore, it just makes it easier to just write to our office or to anyone else's office and have a conversation. So the local ecosystem and the local community is really important. So again, you don't have to be a company that is founded in Singapore. You can actually have an R&D center in Singapore or have headquarters in Singapore as well, just for ease of business. And there's actually some venture capital funds that specifically ask companies to have a holding in Singapore, just to make the investment easier and a potential exit as well. So a few big names. So Garena is started out as a game publishing company. They've now done other businesses as well. They have a company called Shopee, which is an online marketplace. It's the first company in Singapore that listed. Is it the first one? Yes, the first one. So they listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And even this is interesting. So they've gone through a cycle of up and down. I know that the stock price is up again. But it was a big story, and I think everyone was proud that a Singaporean tech company is able to list on the New York Stock Exchange. 100% we're going to see more companies do that over the next few years. Another big one is Lazada, which got acquired by Alibaba a few years ago. Again, a very strong player in several countries. Very important when it comes to them making acquisitions, them working with other startups. So for instance, for the logistics, they would work with other startups in their respective countries. But again, we're also seeing that Singapore is able to attract large companies that will have their holding company. So for Flipkart, they decided to build their holding company out of Singapore. Again, it all began with building an ecosystem for startups that has evolved into them being the hub in Southeast Asia when it comes to tech companies. So I'm not gonna, as someone like, I'm not gonna talk about every single scheme, but I do want to show this because it gives a reflection of how much there is available for startups. I'm Dutch, born and raised. Our government doesn't have this many grants for startups, and it's all different. So there's a few ones that are more linked to helping VC funds. The other ones are more linked to purely helping innovations when it comes to IP, deep tech. Other ones are more general grants. But I think it's pretty impressive that a small country like Singapore has been able to build an ecosystem that looks like this. And then more importantly, they're active investors. So they have entities that are really active investors. So Temasek and GIC are known as very large sovereign wealth funds. But if you look at, for instance, the EDBI, which is a sort of government-backed VC fund, they focus on Series B investments. They are very active investments and made co-investments with us as well. It's funny, when we were making the slide, I was surprised by how many grants there are in Singapore. Maybe we should make use of them. So here's another thing when it comes to the ecosystem. And for me, this is funny to look at. On my first trip to Singapore, I think that I recognized maybe 4 or 5 names. And this is now what this has evolved to in the last few years. And the funny thing is, it is not only about funds. So if you look at the number of government entities that provide investments, that provide help, assistance, there's quite a few. I talked about the co-working spaces earlier, but also events is very important. To have on-the-ground events, to have on-the-ground media, literally helping, showcasing what is happening on the ground. You need conferences, well, like NextRise as well, to showcase the companies that are kind of trying to make it. You need media to kind of talk about these companies continuously so people notice them. As I mentioned, the accelerators, we could have made 4 pages with accelerators, but there's a large number of accelerators as well to kind of help these founders at an early stage. And I think what is funny is even the accelerator model has evolved. I don't know if you guys know Antler. So Antler is an accelerator that launched about 2 years ago, headquartered in Singapore. The model where they basically say, we'll pair you as a founder with another co-founder, and you guys build a business in the next 3 months. It's actually a very interesting concept. And they've now successfully had 2 cohorts, and they've expanded to other cities around the globe. But even accelerators in Singapore have evolved their model to kind of to this day and age. So just really brief, just want to quickly highlight 2 companies. So I talked about Carousel earlier, one of our first investments. Again, the reason why this is interesting, and I want to sort of show this again, is the fact that you're able to build a company which, if you look at it from a Western market perspective, you would say it makes no sense to build an Alibaba for mobile. But being on the ground and getting a sense of all these kids being on their mobile phones, and if they want to buy something, the first thing they'll do is they'll look at their phones and sort of compare prices or do some discovery. You kind of understand the importance of mobile for these young people, and you understand that this company is able to kind of build a sustainable business. So I think for us, sort of being on the ground in these different countries over the last 7 to 8 years, also helped us shape that opportunities are different. They are very different. When it comes to homage as well, so homage, if you guys know Honor in the US, when it comes to elderly care, so an elderly care platform, founded in Singapore, and now expanding to other countries. What is interesting, I was in Europe 2 weeks ago, and I was kind of talking about our portfolio, and the funny part was that people in France and Germany said, we actually need this in our market. So we're now seeing innovation happening in Singapore that is able to expand to mature markets, like for instance Germany or the Netherlands. I'm not saying that homage will kind of expand to the Netherlands, but I'm saying we're seeing more and more opportunity of companies that have been founded in Singapore and are now examples for companies all over the globe. Guys, I've held up for 45 minutes, and you guys did as well. So no one's fallen asleep, everyone's still awake. Thank you for your attention. If you want to hear more, learn more about us, the firm, about Southeast Asia, about Singapore, about startups, this is where you can find me. Thank you for your attention. And it's almost time for drinks.
Well, thank you very much. Well, instead of taking those pictures, I'll be looking forward to have more questions or Slido. Please use the code 9769 to be with us. So let us start from the first question. How many startups in the shipping industry are there in Singapore? Have Golden Gate Ventures ever experienced with funding for them?
I would say shipping specifically is relatively new when it comes to startups. So one example is Techstars recently launched a shipping cohort in Singapore, and they're doing it with a large local shipping company. We do have a lot of experience with logistics. So logistics is very, very country specific, and a few companies kind of do it cross-border. So we have a lot of experience with kind of what logistics look like. Logistics is a large container, because there is first mile, last mile, there is customs, there is warehousing. So we have a lot of experience sort of in that market. When it comes to shipping, I think of freight forwarding, for example. We've definitely seen companies in Singapore, but they haven't flourished yet. I think that's going to be a bit more of a longer term play.
So I'm sure that Ethan, maybe you can play a role there, starting a new company at the Singapore. And now let's move on to the next question. You mentioned tech or startup conference in Singapore. If I could visit one, which would be the best one?
That's unfair, because now you make me pick one conference. Wow.
Yeah, tech or startup.
Yes. Man, Vinny, help me out here. So the first one that comes to mind would be Tech in Asia. I think they've been around for the longest in the region as a conference. There's Echelon, E27. So I'd say if I can name two, maybe.
Okay,
I'd say,
two.
Yeah,
two
Tech in Asia and E27 would be the best conferences to visit.
Tech Asia and what?
Tech in Asia.
Tech in Asia.
And E27.
E27.
Yeah, those would be the best two.
Okay, these are the two. And moving on to the next question. If all the grants and subsidies from the government would not exist, how many startups could really survive without it?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. So I think in any ecosystem, even the US, if you look at the Department of Defense, they were very important in starting the Silicon Valley ecosystem. I think in any ecosystem, it's important to have it. I don't want to say that grants are sort of the magic potion to start up an ecosystem, but it's helpful. If I look at sort of our first portfolio, there weren't too many companies that used grants, maybe 2 or 3 out of 22 companies. So I think there is a huge factor of attraction, that you're able to attract talent if you have it in place. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to use it. So I would say I'm bullish. I think that easy 70% would be able to survive without grants. I think as a company, if you are unable to survive without grants, you have other issues. That's what I would say.
Well, still 70%, it's a high amount. Well, moving on to our next question. If a Korean setup company in, if a Korean setup company in Singapore, would the company be able to receive grants? Well, I think that's relevant. You said that 70% will survive still without the grant, but...
Yeah. So when it comes to grants for foreign companies, Singapore does a lot in terms of attracting foreign talent. Again, there are a lot of grants in Singapore. I wouldn't know which one you should exactly apply for. But there is a few government organizations that literally help startups when they come to the region. There's an economic development board that kind of guides you within who should you be talking to within Singapore in the ecosystem if you are a foreign company coming to Singapore.
Well, at the former session, we talked about Singapore ecosystem, startup ecosystem, and she mentioned about this, a website that has everything about startup. Do you know? Does it ring a bell?
Yeah, so you have, there is SG Innovate.
Yes, right,
Yes,
SG Innovate.
SG Innovate is a very important proponent for helping guiding startups to the ecosystem. Yeah.
Well, shall we move on to the next question? What, if any, how many companies in Singapore are building on open, permissionless blockchain network? Whoa.
Can I ask one question? Is that the real Satoshi or is that someone else?
Well, Satoshi, where are you?
Yeah, maybe anonymous. Yeah, so actually it's a good one. So what Singapore has been trying to do initially when blockchain started, we even helped co-write one of the consulting papers when it comes to blockchain, because they were trying to build at least sort of a basic infrastructure. I wouldn't say how many companies in Singapore. So Singapore has been very open when it comes to the blockchain infrastructure. I think at some point in time, at the biggest hype of crypto, Singapore had almost the largest number of blockchain companies. I won't dare to say if they were all good companies, but there were a lot of blockchain companies. So I would say that there's large numbers of companies still in Singapore that focus on blockchain. Just as an example, Binance opened their office in Singapore about a year and a half ago. So the larger players are there, and again, that also attracts a lot of blockchain companies. So again, I can't tell a number, but if you need connections to sort of the blockchain community, there's enough available.
Yeah, well, Satoshi, maybe you can ask him afterwards before he goes get a drink. Well, so next question. What is your thought on the future of deep tech in Singapore in terms of government support and growth?
Yeah, super bullish. So there's A-Star in Singapore, which actually is it's a bit of a mix. It's sort of an incubator. So they try to encourage more deep tech startups in Singapore. So they help, they invest. As mentioned earlier, Temasek now did a joint venture with one of the universities, where actually they help professors launch deep tech companies. So in that sense, very bullish. I do think one critical point. This boils down to talent, and when it comes to deep tech talent, you are competing with other markets. So when it comes to the US, when it comes to China, there's a lot of talent on deep tech sense there. So Singapore would have to compete with those markets as well.
So is it one of the part that is going to show some rapid growth?
Yeah, so Singapore has clearly defined deep tech as one of their most important kind of next markets / industries.
Okay. Then our next question, when do you think is the best time to get funded?
When you don't need money. That is, yeah, in any company's life cycle, the thing that you don't want to do is, when you urgently need money, is start fundraising. So, as a founder, think of kind of what does my next 12 months look like, and when do I think I need funding, and then 6 months ahead, you should start thinking about who am I talking to. Just remind, for VCs, it is just important that you are able to showcase growth. So if you are looking for funding and your growth is flat, or worse, it's negative, it becomes very difficult. So when you are in a position that your company is growing and is showing clear growth, it is a good time to talk to seed investors, VCs, to explain what you're doing as a company, and then hopefully you'll get funded.
And at the former session, we also talked about this kind of question, and the speaker told us that, well, managing your reputation means a lot when you get funded. So do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways. So for both investors and founders, that's very important. We always encourage founders that we don't invest in, for example, to stay in touch. We'll do the same. So there's one company which is funny. So it's they're in the food delivery, and we looked it up years ago. They're still sending updates, and they're still keeping us informed about what's happening within the company. And it doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden going to invest, but he is always top of mind, and he has open communication. So I think that is very important. Yeah.
Okay, we have new question. Are there any local startups or sectors that NIS interested in expanding to Korean market?
So I'd say initially you'll see more Korean companies looking to expand to Southeast Asia, just for the sheer market size. if I just think about our portfolio, there's one company that is looking to explore, to see, can they expand here. I think Korea has a few sort of interesting challenges for companies to attack. But I say it's more common for Korean companies to expand to Southeast Asia.
Yeah, but can you think of any example that rings a bell in terms of trying to expand to Korean market from overseas?
Well, it's funny, we talked about it earlier today. So when it comes to elderly care, there's different regulation here, but again, I do think that mature markets like Korea could kind of use more platforms that help with elderly care. So I think that's an opportunity for the Korean market.
Okay, since we have about 5 minutes, I think this would be the perfect time to get some questions from the floor. Yes, I can see a hand raised. 네, 저희 마이크 전달 부탁드리도록 할게요.
Mike?
Yes, there is a mic.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I had a question about the fact that there are so many startups starting up and going away and so forth. What is the mechanism for you to really find out which startups to invest or to find out more? Not only in Singapore but globally. How do you actually meet them or contact them and so forth? Is there an online platform you use, or is there a mechanism that you use?
So I think our approach is very community driven. So one great source for us is actually our existing portfolio. So the founders that we've invested in, they know us, they know what we like, they know our style. So they tend to refer other founders to us. So that's kind of one form. The second one would be we use a lot of data. So as a firm, we're all techies ourselves. So we use a lot of data in our firm to, I would almost say, predict where the next industry that's gonna grow fast, and then we look for companies within that industry. And then there is still conferences like this. We try to be out there speaking at conferences at universities, host events, and it's a great way to kind of meet people.
Is there any other questions?
My name is Veronica. I'm wondering, is there specific areas of industry you're looking for investment, or you're quite open to any areas of business?
So because we focus our attention on Southeast Asia, we tend to invest in everything around the consumer internet journey. So if you take commerce as an example, there's a few things that are growing as commerce is growing. Think of payments, think of logistics, think of content. So we tend to invest in sort of those industries. I would say we have invested a bit more in SME SaaS companies as well, because that's kind of the next wave that is happening in Southeast Asia. I would say those are the two biggest buckets for us. Sorry? Yeah, correct. Yeah, but we when you talk about consumer internet, it is a pretty broad spectrum.
Okay, that I believe might be the last question.
Hi, good afternoon. Last I was in Singapore, there was a growing trend amongst companies, not just there, but perhaps in different areas, of investing or resources into companies that are much larger and helping them to innovate like a startup. Is that trend still big in Singapore in terms of the accelerators there? Or are they actually going for like seed companies, like seeding new companies completely?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a bit of both. So I think now the ecosystem is maturing. You are seeing companies, I'll give one example. So Unilever, they publicly announced it. They're working with a logistics company in Malaysia. So one might say they were able to incubate it themselves, but in this case they decided to work with an existing company. But then Unilever also has level 3, and they're basically saying, if you have a great idea that could work within our core business, we'll give you space, we'll give you a desk to sit, we'll give you resources, and you can actually work with the different departments within Unilever to help build your company. So they have sort of two strategies when it comes to there's some internal innovation, and then there is companies they invest in or potentially acquire. What I've seen in Europe is, in Europe you will actually have startups that are built to help big companies innovate. And there's one famous one in Germany. It's called the TI Group, and they help the big automotive industries innovate internally. I haven't seen that trend that strong in Singapore just yet.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's all for the presentation prepared by Golden Gates Ventures' Michael Lynch. Please give him a big hand.
Thank you.